started, although I'm sure we'll have some people coming in. My name is Ilana Singh. I'm Professor of Neuroscience and Society in the Department of Psychiatry, and we work closely with colleagues from the Richardson Centre for Nature Recovery on nature-based mental health and flourishing. So that's why I'm here to introduce Professor Miles Richardson, Professor of Human Factors and Nature Connectedness at the University of Derby. He founded the award-winning Nature Connectedness Research Group, which aims to understand and improve the connection with nature, importantly for the good of humans and for the good of nature. So that's something that we're also very interested in our flourishing program. His book, Reconnection, Fixing Our Broken Relationship with Nature, was published in April 2023 and is actually available in the Atmosphere Room for signing and purchasing after this talk. So we're really delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
And thank you. And we're going to have about 45 minutes of a lecture and then a Q&A to follow, and then you're all invited to the reception afterwards. So
thank you very much. That's very kind. And thank you all for coming along. Nice to see so many people. Yes, that's me, Miles Richardson. You can follow my work. I'm still sticking with Twitter for now, but you can see my blog address there, where I post things pretty regularly in a longer format. Well, that's well, just switched itself off, so I'll go for that. We're now there. It's gone to sleep while you thought you'd done all your work. All right, okay. Well, there we are. I could have worked that out, I think, just about. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I've structured the kind of talk around the book, but obviously there's a lot more content in the book than I can fit into 45 minutes. So it's split into 3 bits: the need for reconnection with nature, the benefits of reconnecting with nature, and then the big question, I suppose, how do we reconnect people with nature at scale, at a societal scale? On the 3 sections, I've put some little things that I found out right in the book, which was some of the things that stuck out to me that I didn't know before I started. So our broken relationship with nature. So I kind of start out saying the sorry story of our broken relationship with nature. So I see climate warming, the loss of biodiversity, the mental health crisis as well as symptoms of that broken relationship or failing relationship, however you want to term it, with the rest of the natural world. The 4 minutes 36 is just one indication from a study that we did in Sheffield, where we gave, well, we had to persuade almost people to download an app that tracked them through the 1,000 green spaces in Sheffield, and that 4 minutes 36 seconds was the median amount of time people spent in a green space each day. So we're very detached physically from the natural world as well as psychologically. And this, I've just put these up because I came up with the biodiversity stripes, and this is just another representation of the failing relationship with nature. So 69% loss of biodiversity going by the LPI index, and they're Ed Hawkins climate warming stripes, so matched year for year. So in my lifetime, there's been a change from blue and green to red and grey. And I see another symptom of our disconnection with the natural world by the amount of money we spend funding research to show that nature is beneficial to humans. There's decades of research that explores that. We're starting to be accepted now that the natural world is good for people, but we would never question whether a fish needs a river or a bird needs the sky or a gorilla needs the forest. And I see that as a kind of sign of our symptom of the disconnection as well. Another sign is the use of nature words in cultural products. So this is just a chart of the appearance of nature words in English fiction. It's a little bit old now, but it shows the last century basically. And you can see the dip in usage of nature words, particularly trees and flowers, since 1950. And the analysis that they did suggested that might be introductions of technology. So as new waves of technology came in, nature featured less and less in cultural products. And people have done the same in books, films, and song lyrics as well. So you kind of get a similar lack of reference to nature in cultural outputs. And then this is just another little chart to kind of illustrate how things have changed. Again, the green line there is just the LPI global index, 69% loss of biodiversity since 1970. And then the red line is just a Google Ngram of the frequency of the use of the word me since 1970. So you can see since the kind of late 90s, the use of the word me has gone up very steeply. And that's captured nicely in that cartoon by Ralph Underhill there. And another graphic, if I've not hammered home the point enough yet, is this isn't our research. This is a figure I created from the data in the global biomass of wild mammals in a paper that was out earlier this year. So just another sign of the human dominance of life on Earth. So humans by weight, our cattle and livestock by weight, our pets are the same now as the wild land mammals in mass, and then obviously the marine ones as well. And I'll introduce what nature connectedness is in a couple of slides' time, but this is a measure of nature connection. I'll explain what that is. And this is a league table of these 18, I think, nations that have had a survey of the level of nature connectedness of I think it was 1,000 people in each of those countries had their nature connection measured in a project at Exeter University. And there's a league table there of biodiversity as well and well-being. And you can start to see the relationship where the UK in particular is at the bottom of that table, has lower levels of nature connection, lower levels of biodiversity, and lower levels of well-being. And I think it's just interesting how I've grown up thinking that we were a nation of nature lovers, and you hear of our green and pleasant land, and we celebrate our nature documentaries, and we celebrate the poets and the artists who depict the natural world. But we're one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet, and our level of nature connection, our relationship with nature is particularly weak as well. It's not a very encouraging story. Thankfully, there is signs now over the past few years that some major global institutions are starting to recognize that the route to a more sustainable and biodiverse future requires a new relationship with nature, and that terminology is seen more frequently now in releases from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Environmental Programme. The Stockholm Plus 50 is a UN commissioned evidence report that was out last year. The agreement from COP15, Target 12, I think, refers to connection with nature. And the European Environment Agency briefing from earlier this year is interesting as well, because that talks very much about our relationship with nature in quite a kind of spiritual, psychological way, as does the Dasgupta review as well. Actually, it's a few years old. It's interesting with the Dasgupta review. It's 600 pages long, and it's got quite a lot of content on our spiritual, psychological relationship with nature. But in the summary for policymakers, that's all gone, and it's very dry kind of recommendations. So in the book, and this isn't my area, I read a lot about anthropological evidence and the like. So I really enjoyed doing that and trying to take the long view of how we as a species have come from being embedded in the natural world and getting our existence from a very embedded relationship with the rest of the natural world, perhaps not even seeing the fact that there was a kind of natural world because we were so embedded within it, to a point through the agricultural and scientific and industrial and technological revolutions where we now live our lives mainly indoors, as we all know, surrounded by our technology, and the natural world is very much in a box that's out there, and obviously that natural world is suffering and in decline. And as a technological ape, we're one of the great apes, and we're defined by our technology. That's got us to where we are now. We like to use technological symptoms. So we're looking for greener ways of consuming stuff, greener ways of creating energy. And we have, maybe not so technical, but we focus on the symptoms, and we're restoring habitat and restoring nature. Whereas as I say, I see those as symptoms, and the cause is our relationship with nature. So we still need to treat the symptoms, but we need to think about restoring our relationship as well, because that will be the make those technical solutions more successful, and it will be a longer term strategy as well. So a little bit depressing, I suppose, at the moment, our disconnection with nature, but there's some very almost magical links that remain latent within us to the rest of the natural world. And these are just a few examples. If you put the right sensors on people and measure their heart rate variability, for example, and place them in a woodland, sat on a chair in a woodland, you can detect the changes in physiology as the nervous system calms. And that same effect, where nature is helping balance our moods and regulate our emotions, you can find that as well in a laboratory setting. If you ask people to view a bunch of roses for 3 minutes, you can get those same physiological markers and traces come through as you would if you were sat in a woodland. Similarly, if you blindfold people and put them in a laboratory and ask them to put the palm of their hand on various materials, when it's placed on untreated wood, you get the same effect. So the body knows when it is in contact with natural materials, which is, I don't know how, perhaps some people here do, but I don't. Quite remarkable. In Sheffield, we asked people with the mobile phone app in the green spaces to rate those green spaces for biodiversity. Just members of the public, no training. They could estimate the level of biodiversity quite accurately, surprisingly, in a ranking type of way. So we've kind of got this innate ability to notice where's more biodiverse and less biodiverse. The microbiome, microbes there, just that little graphic, that reflects the research that shows our microbiome is healthier in people who grow up in near urban woodlands and near a woodland setting, for example. And similarly, the amygdala in the brain, which is involved in our managing our emotions, that there's research that shows that's better formed in people who grow up near a natural environment. I think again that was urban woodland. So you kind of got these innate physical connections, and that leads us on to us nature connectedness, which is our psychological connection with nature. And I think that's a false barrier as well. There's kind of no divide between physical and psychological, but it's the same kind of fracture almost that separates us from the natural world. And so it's different to contact and exposure to nature. That's the key thing. Nature connectedness, or nature connection is the kind of informal term, is our sense of relationship with the natural world. And it can be cognitive, it's a belief, I am part of the natural world, I'm part of the wider ecology of the natural world, or emotional, and it's I got a strong emotional bond to the rest of the natural world. And we can use psychometric scales to measure that, and we do. And once, obviously, you can measure something, that allows you to do some science, and you can do cross-sectional research to find out a bit more about what's happening if you're more deeply connected with nature, and you can start to do intervention studies to see if you can improve people's relationship with nature. And we've found that although it's quite traity, you can bring about sustained improvements in nature connectedness. And obviously, there's been decades of research into people's relationship with nature broadly. I think this psychological construct has taken off because it allows the science, the facts and figures that convince policymakers and decision makers and the like. So it's gone from, there was a single journal article that used the term in 2001. There was 72 used it in 2013, and there was 1,400 last year. So there's been a very steep rise in the research in that area, starting to show that it's perhaps a basic psychological need. And the exciting thing for me is it unites both human and nature's well-being, which I'll come on to. So hopefully there's a sense that nature connectedness matters, and we've got a broken relationship with nature. And then we can look at the benefits of reconnection, which is one of the justifications for trying to improve it and to see whether that makes any difference. And there's just one of the other facts and figures I found out while researching the book that I was quite blown away by. Each person is a community of half human and half microbial cells. But the microbes have obviously got quite a bad rap, and we buy products to kill 99% of germs and all that. But most microbes aren't bad for us. Many are integral to our health. And you find more pathogenic species in an urban sports field as you would in a woodland, despite a woodland having many more diversity of microbes. So we move on to the health benefits, and broadly, a stronger bond with the natural world is related to feeling good and functioning well. So feeling good, you can work it out from the words on the screen. They're things like vitality, happiness, and the like. Functioning well, it's higher levels of feeling your life is worthwhile, personal growth, meaning and purpose, so that kind of deeper eudaimonic well-being. And in a cross-sectional study that we did back in 2016, I think, with Natural England, we found that the level of nature connectedness was 4 times more important in explaining eudaimonic well-being, feeling your life is worthwhile, than socioeconomic status, which is a accepted benchmark measure. And nature visits, which is often focused on, wasn't significant in that. There's obviously other health benefits to nature visits, but particularly on that worthwhile life measure. So it's quite interesting. When you start to measure connectedness rather than visits, you start to get a more nuanced picture of what's happening. And you get some other interesting benefits as well, like pro-social behavior and improved body image for people with higher levels of nature connectedness. And then on the other side, or the same side, I should say, of the benefits to the natural world, there's been enough research now for systematic reviews. The systematic reviews, 2 systematic reviews on the health benefits, and there's 2 systematic reviews now on the pro-environmental behavior benefits, which have found a strong and robust link between nature connection and pro-environmental behaviors, including some evidence of a causal link as well. So this is just to highlight the difference again between exposure to nature, which is good for us, being out in green spaces and going to the park has health benefits. But if you're actively engaged with nature, repeatedly noticing and enjoying nature, you get perhaps slightly different, maybe more benefits, and the benefits start to have a reciprocal relationship where it's good for nature and good for you. You are more likely to give back to nature as well. So on this kind of little journey through what nature connectedness is, when we measured it across the UK, we found this teenage dip in nature connectedness. Others have found it now in Canadian, Chinese and Australian populations, I think, similar dip. So it starts out high on this is on the NCI. There's about 12 scales you can use to measure it. This is one of them. Starts out high, it goes up to 100 or high-ish, and then drops quite starkly down to when people are 13 and 15, and then slowly goes back up towards the national mean. And everybody knows, everybody in the room will have been through their teenage years. Other things start to matter then. Peer-to-peer relationships are very important. You start to learn to manage your emotions in a kind of more adult setting, I suppose. And nature perhaps takes a back seat. And that green line is very speculative, and it's based on the next slide, but I've just kind of put that in as perhaps that's where we need to get to for a more sustainable future. So just to help explain the relationship between nature connection and pro-nature behaviours, that study again I've just shown you, the mean across the UK population was 61, which doesn't mean a great deal on its own, but for people who reported in that survey, they did nothing for the environment. They don't recycle, they do nothing. Their mean NCI was 47. For people who said they recycle, don't do anything else, it's quite easy to recycle. It doesn't take much effort now because we have all the bins and what have you. Their mean NCI was 63, so a little bit higher. But for people who reported that they're actively involved in pro-nature conservation volunteering, for example, it rose up to 76. So they're people who are kind of really getting involved in that work. So you can start to see where you've got that relationship in a reasonably simple way. Another thing that we've done is look at pro-environmental behaviours and pro-nature conservation behaviours. It's a bit odd. It's similar to the press coverage on climate and biodiversity. So until recently, climate is very much dominated. I think it gets 8 to 10 times as much coverage as biodiversity loss. Starting to change a little bit. And from a psychological perspective, a lot of the research has gone on pro-environmental behaviours, those positive inactions that are related broadly to carbon and resource use. So don't drive, don't fly. We couldn't find a scale on pro-nature conservation behaviours. So habitat creation broadly, it could be in the wider domain or in your own personal domain if you're fortunate enough to have a garden to do that sort of thing in. So we developed a pro-nature conservation behaviour scale because we work quite closely with the nature conservation NGOs, and they wanted to measure that. And we found that they are different types of behaviour. There's different kind of psychological aspects when you start to look at the data. And we did some work on that with the National Trust. So we did a survey of adults in the UK. We used our new ProCOBS, we call it, Pro Nature Conservation Behaviour Scale, and we looked at how nature connectedness, time in nature, tuning in and noticing nature, and indirect engagement with nature, nature books, for example, and programs, knowledge and study of nature, which often gets quite a lot of emphasis, valuing nature and concern for nature and pro-environmental behaviours, explained people's pro-nature conservation behaviours. And what we found was all of those factors together explained 70% of people's positive actions for nature, which is a pretty high figure. But the most important contributor was simply noticing nature. People who noticed birdsong and noticed butterflies flying around tended to do more for nature. The amount of time they spent in nature wasn't significant. The knowledge and study of nature wasn't significant. Their values and concern weren't significant in that, where all those factors were in together. And the level of nature connectedness was very strongly related. So you can start to see how that relationship, and active relationship as well, is really important if you want to get people involved in pro-nature conservation behaviours. And this slide doesn't particularly fit in the flow, but it's while we're kind of vaguely talking about measures of nature connectedness. This again is from that multi-nation survey across 18 nations. We looked at nature connectedness in those countries and the relationship to well-being and biodiversity, which you saw on the table earlier. I just thought it was interesting that if you looked at those countries' sustainable development rankings, you got the opposite relationship. So the higher up the sustainable development ranking they were, they had a negative relationship to biodiversity, perhaps because they're trying to recover biodiversity. They had a negative relationship to well-being, which is interesting, and a negative relationship to nature connectedness. So it's just to illustrate that it's quite a good metric to aim for to try and improve those levels of nature connectedness. So just kind of coming towards the end of that section on introducing nature connectedness and why it matters for human and nature's well-being. That's kind of the research over the past 10 years or so. Just a few highlights from 2023. It's difficult to know whether our relationship with nature has been getting worse. The use of nature words kind of indicates perhaps it does, because we can track that over time. But there was a nice systematic review done earlier this year that showed that people's psychological and physical connections to nature have been declining over time, and that was a global study. So it's nice to have that confirmed. It's not a nice fact, but it's good to know that that's the general trajectory. And the benefits of nature connection are starting to get through into the conservation community. So there was a journal in Conservation Letters suggesting that human nature connection was a useful direction, but it's yet to become mainstream in practice. And similarly in Biological Conservation, a systematic review that noted that the benefits of nature connection for human health and nature's health, but it's neglected by current public policy. So there's very little policy that's aiming directly at improving that, which we'll come on to a little bit later. So the decline in nature connection is real. It matters for human and nature's well-being, but sadly is often overlooked. So the kind of final third is, how do we go about creating a new relationship? So hopefully you kind of can see in the evidence that perhaps it is a good thing. It's good for people and it's good for the natural world. How do we improve it? And I started off doing some very simple interventions, which I'll cover briefly, and then we're kind of trying to scale them up to think, how do you do those at a societal scale? And there's another thing I didn't know. Obviously, I'd heard of the term survival of the fittest. I didn't know that Darwin apologized for using it, apparently. And he used the word love 90 times, I think, I read, in The Descent of Man. So it just shows how the survival of the fittest was a term that suited the age and has suited decades afterwards, whereas he was talking more about relationships, and it's relationships that perhaps make the world go round. So if you're trying to improve nature connectedness, a lot of people turn to education. This is only one study, but there's been a systematic review that's confirmed pretty much the same, that environmental knowledge doesn't feed through to ecological behaviours. So this is just one study. I pick it because the numbers are quite stark. Explaining 2% of ecological behaviour, but nature connectedness explaining 69% of ecological behaviour in children in this instance. So where I started out in 2013, I'm an engineer by background, so I like solutions. So I started off with an intervention. Oddly, that didn't. We were doing other work at the same time, but I wanted to develop a simple intervention that perhaps could improve nature connectedness. And I took a twist on the noting 3 good things a day intervention, which is the positive psychology intervention you may have heard of. And I just added in nature onto the end of that. So at the end of each day, write down 3 good things that you see in nature. When people did that for a week, we found sustained increases in nature connectedness. And in another study as well, we found significant increases in mental health as well that were sustained for a month. And for people living with a mental health condition, those were clinically significant improvements as well. And we've done 2 or 3 studies using that 3 good things in nature approach now. And we've also most recently combined it with citizen science approaches. So doing the fit counts or butterfly counts, for example, getting people to do them, and then seeing if they impacted on well-being, nature conservation behaviours, and nature connectedness. And we found doing the citizen science did help with well-being, and it did help with nature connectedness. But if you added on the 3 good things, so you ask people to count, but then kind of consider and reflect on the good things, the nature connectedness improved a bit more, and the pro-nature conservation behaviours improved. Weirdly, although people were doing the citizen science because they thought they were contributing, it didn't make a difference to their pro-nature conservation behaviours. But when they were noticing the good things in nature at the same time, they did report that. So it's quite an important thing to combine the counting with the calm and joy that nature brings, and just simply prompting people to notice the good things in nature does have a powerful effect. But the trouble is, most people don't notice nature. So again, in this work with the National Trust, 80% of people rarely or never watch wildlife, don't listen to bird song, smell wildflowers and the like. And there's eye tracking evidence as well that shows that less connected people tend to look at buildings rather than trees if they're in an urban environment, for example. And in the lockdown, coincidentally, we started, or the Natural England started measuring nature connectedness and noticing nature in March 2020. So we were able to have a look at those survey results, and we found that visits to nature went up. We'll all recognise that because that was the only thing you could do. But noticing nature increased even more. And when we looked at what was explaining well-being and pro-nature conservation behaviours, which was also in that survey, we found that it was the increases in noticing nature rather than the recent increases in visits that were explaining well-being and pro-nature conservation behaviours. So the trouble is, if you asking people to notice the good things in nature, it's not going to lead to any systemic societal change. You can promote it as a good thing to do. So we've also developed a design framework, which we call the pathways to nature connectedness. And those pathways are basically buttons to press. So organisations, this is widely used, that the National Trust adopted it pretty early on, and there's dozens of organisations use it now that are engaged in kind of human nature engagement programs. And the buttons that you need to try and build in to those programs are sensory contact, appreciating the beauty of the natural world, noticing the joy and calm that nature brings, celebrating the meaning of nature in your life. So those kind of deeper moments with nature that you might reflect on in art or poetry or songs or whatever, and giving the opportunity for people to care for nature as well. In that research that came up with the pathways, it was based on the 9 values of biophilia from a long time ago, Kellett's values from 1991. Those are the 5 types of activity that did explain a close relationship with nature. These are the 4 that didn't. And so similarly, the scientific relationship with nature wasn't explaining nature connectedness, so a purely scientific one. And then, as you might expect, the utilitarian practical use didn't, the dominionistic control and dominance of nature, and obviously nature can be very dangerous as well. So the negativistic aversion from and fear of certain aspects of nature wasn't related to a close relationship with nature, which as you'd expect. But as a whole, you might look at those as pathways for survival and progress rather than a rounded and sustainable relationship with nature. And we've just done a paper that was out in Sustainability in August, and we compared interpersonal relationships with human-nature relationships, and we found many parallels. And I like to think of the human-nature relationship as the same as any other relationship that we might have in our personal lives and work lives. Like elsewhere in life, a lasting and sustainable relationship comes through noticing emotion, finding beauty, meaning and compassion. So I mentioned the pathways have been quite widely used. 30 Days Wild, if you've heard of that, we work with the Wildlife Trusts, and the initial activities that when that launched in 2015, 2016, I think about 1 million people took part in the first 5 years. So we looked at taking part in 30 Days Wild, and that improved nature connectedness as well, which is good. The National Trust adopted it, as I said, so the revamp of 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4, we worked on that was released Easter 2019, I think. We've been working on a biophilic school, and government programs like Generation Green and the Green Influencers use the pathways as well as within their kind of training materials. And it's also started to be used in the design of places a little bit. So like the Durrell Butterfly House is one example, and that's where we're trying to start to think about how do you design an urban space that activates those pathways to nature connectedness, in this effort to try and scale it up, to start thinking at a societal scale, how do you improve nature connectedness? So I've tried to summarize that in this simple way. Our current failing relationship is based on the red arrow, the use, control, consumption relationship with nature, which dominate. And then we need to try and improve do more of the activities and have more of the relationships in the green arrow. So fostering closer relationships, more engagement, noticing, enjoying, celebrating, caring for nature, to increase nature connection, and then hopefully mental well-being, pro-nature behaviours, pro-environmental behaviours. So you've got that journey to a more sustainable and worthwhile life. And we start to look at transformational change theories as well in that, and the importance of leverage points and creating visions and opportunities and actions for people to get involved with, and how you feed back on how that engagement is being a success. So that's the focus of a lot of what we do now. And I just wanted to return back to this data again. This is from the table, same data from that table, because this helped us look at the big macro factors that might be affecting individual levels of nature connectedness. So this, you can see along the bottom, nature connectedness there, and then well-being as well. And you can see the UK is near the bottom for nature connectedness and near the bottom for well-being, but I've drawn a circle around those, and you know, if anyone can, nobody's going to offer to speak, but if anyone can notice anything about those countries, Hong Kong, United Kingdom, US, Australia and Canada, and Ireland, perhaps there's something to do with the former parts of the British Empire and a relationship with nature that we perhaps exported. I don't know. It's just interesting to reflect on. But when we looked at the factors in those countries that related to nature connectedness of the individuals, we found that wealth, the more wealthy a country was, the lower the level of nature connectedness. The level of technology, the more technology there was in a country, the smartphone use, for example, the lower the level of nature connectedness. The higher the level of biodiversity, the higher the level of nature connectedness, which you might expect. Land use was a big factor. So the more pasture land in a country, the lower the level of nature connectedness. And obviously there's a lot of pasture land in the UK and Ireland. And as you might guess, urbanization, the more urban areas, the lower the level of nature connection. And children, unfortunately, the younger the age of the population, the less connected it to nature it was. And perhaps that's a sign of the shifting baseline. If biodiversity matters, if you've got more older people, they might have had more engagement with nature through their lives, and that spreads through the population. That was just, we haven't explored any deeper than those relationships. So it suggests, for example, with children, there's a need to look at education, perhaps, and the way our schools and the aims of education. And this is where you start to do the green arrow and think about leverage points. So we want to place our effort where we get the most return. But from the leverage points research, that's Donella Meadows from 1999, she died a few weeks ago. 99% of the effort goes in the lower, weaker leverage points around parameters and standards, and a lot of debate getting those through. But we tend not to change the aims and values. For example, the aims of education. If you go to the DfE website and look what the aims of education are in this country, you won't see mention of sustainability or anything environmental. But you would have thought at this time with the environmental crises, that was a critical thing to do. So thankfully, those reports, those global reports, are starting to take notice of the nature connectedness research. So the Stockholm Plus 50, for example, recommended using the pathways to design education policy and curricula, for example. And that's just one. These are references to our work in policy documents. You can see a couple of dozen have been used and cited in many times across many policy bodies in 12 countries, which is great as a researcher. But an interesting aspect is the four main areas of interest are the relationships to well-being, to pro-environmental behaviours, pro-nature conservation behaviours, and how you do it at a societal scale. So you can see that people or bodies are starting to take note of the research in this area. I've got a few minutes left, so I'll quickly draw to a close, which I'm kind of nearly there. This isn't related to the book. I kind of put these in because I formed the Nature Connectedness Research Group 10 years ago. So it was kind of 10th birthday this year, and that's always a point to reflect on what's happening. And looking ahead to 2033 perhaps, and whether we'll have nature first communities and nature the first step to well-being, or education that puts nature first. And I threw together this chart of everything that we've done. And I kind of thought I'd leave it in because there's a lot of researchers in the room, and perhaps a lot of researchers at an earlier stage in their career. And it just highlights how the research is quite it's a small part of everything that we do, and how that understanding is part of it. And then you go to the applying, and then you go to the sharing, and then you go to the scaling up. And we've done that in 4 areas around the new relationship with nature. Mental health interventions, we could do loads more on that, but we haven't got the capacity or the funds particularly. So our interventions were part of Mental Health Awareness Week in 2021, for example, and they're used in the RSPB nature prescriptions and the like. And then the pro-nature theme of our research is starting to take off as well. And I mentioned visions. So we held our first event in June on gathering people together to try and create a vision of a more nature connected society in 10 years time we used. And that was a really interesting process, and we'd like to repeat that. We repeated it with people who were like us, researchers and practitioners in the area. We'd like to go out into communities and create those visions of what a nature connectedness society might look like, because it's really empowering and enjoyable thing to get involved with. So that's my very quick run through what's happening. There's lots of further information together. Obviously there's the book, but that's a big long read. There's easy to read guides on my blog. The Mental Health Foundation report is really good, actually. We have a MOOC if you want to do a MOOC. We've got the Nature Connection Handbook, which is very easy to read, over 40,000 downloads. We released the Nature Connected Organisations Handbook on Monday. I think that's had 2,000 or so downloads already. We have the Silk Mill Vision, a report on the vision that I just referred to as a report we did with the National Trust as well. So lots of different sizes of work, depending on how much time or interest that you've got. So in summary, as I say, I see the biodiversity crisis and the warming climate as symptoms of our broken relationship with nature. I think the nature connectedness approach is really powerful because it unites both human and nature's well-being together. And at a time where a lot of the discourse is on all the things that we've got to give and give up our gas boilers and the like. I think a relationship with nature provides a very positive vision for a sustainable future of living with rather than living without. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to questions. I don't know if we need this. Sorry?
There are online questions.
Online questions. Well, we'll do in-room questions first. That gentleman there, yes.
We need to decide the online.
Sorry. Student of public policy at the Biodiversity government. And so my question would be, well, thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. What role?
Sorry, we need this for the online people. Sorry. Is this working though?
It's just for people online.
All right. Yes. So my question would be, what role in this process of fostering connectedness with nature do you see for policy, and what could policymakers do to do this? Because a lot of this seems quite voluntary, as in you probably can't really force people to smell wildflowers, etc. So
Yeah,
what can you do
I
from the
think
government?
That's I'm not a policymaker, so this is where I step into a world I'm not so familiar with, but we do release policy briefings. That some of the guidance are policy briefings of our ideas. So, for example, in healthcare, one of the recommendations was to make nature present in our models of health and well-being. So in the UK, we have the 5 ways to well-being, for example, which is probably the most well-known well-being guidance. It doesn't mention nature at all. So it could do, and it should do. In health, you can start to promote the reality that a close relationship with nature can help manage your moods and keep your emotional regulation in balance, which might help you stay well. So there's policy kind of ideas. Education, you can change the aims of education around developing people's close relationship with nature and bring in those pathways to inform the curriculum. That's 2 areas. So it is possible. And then urban design and the design of places that prompt people, use affordances and the principles like that to prompt people to engage and notice nature. There's potential for quite creative thinking around that. And on a cultural side, the funding that we put into the arts, perhaps some of that should be used for cultural events that celebrate our relationship with the natural world a little more.
We're just going to take a question from online, so I need to say this in the microphone. So this is an online question. Does nature connectedness have any significant difference between temperate regions and tropical regions? And I suppose I would want to extend that to say, I mean, you've shown data largely from the West.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you can comment on areas where, you know, there is more climate change, climate migration, poverty, etc.
I sadly, well, there is some data, but I've not got my hands on it yet. There's a survey of nature connectedness across over 100 nations, I think, that Gallup conducted, and I'm hoping to be able to access that data to look at that. So it is limited at the minute. There are papers that the psychometric scales have been translated into various languages, so it's starting to happen, but we don't know as much as would be really nice to know what if you could look at people's individual levels of nature connectedness across 100 nations and look at those big factors, that would be really powerful information to know. So that we're hoping to do that. But in that limited sample that we had, which was quite homogeneous, really, it was kind of generally European, Western nations, as you say, there was a bit more nature connectedness in the more Southern Europe areas, and we did find a relationship to things like rainfall and stuff. Not as big as biodiversity and other factors, but I think clearly if it is part of it. If you can get outside and spend more time outside, and it's easier to have a culture of engaging in immersing yourself in that natural world.
Yes, as long as the natural world is a friendly world.
Yes, and that's interesting as well, isn't it? Though I mean, that's not my area of work, but there is a little bit in the book of people's relationship, for example, with tigers in India, and yeah, that can be more positive than I might have thought it was. As I say, I'm quite naive to that.
Got a question from Kim. Thanks. So I do nature education with teenagers. So obviously they're the tough crowd.
Yeah.
I've been involved a little bit with the GCSE in natural history,
Yeah.
and I'm developing resources to teach that in due course with one of the local schools. I was wondering whether you've been involved with that, and what would be your recommendations for for the design, I guess, overall of the GCSE? I
was involved at the very early stages of the GCSE natural history. Mary, who got it through so well, invited me on to comment on a few things. I think, and perhaps Mary would admit herself, as it's gone through our system, our disconnected nature from system, it's become, it's not as close as to the original vision, perhaps. Now it's been through the exam boards and it's examinable and we can test the facts and figures and things. So I think it's perhaps lost some of the emotional, cultural aspect that wanted to be in at the start. But hopefully, I'm not involved in the design of curriculum in schools at GCSE level. Perhaps that can be brought back in some ways, because you can do a factual experience where you're surveying nature. Doesn't have to be purely factual. You can bring in those pathways, so you can bring in the emotional side, the awe and wonder of what you might be observing, and emphasize those while you're doing the core content that's got to be done. So I would turn to those pathways to try and press buttons around sensory contact, noticing the joy and calm that nature brings while you're doing the kind of more scientific work, and the meaning of nature to you as well.
Right. So I had a question. Many of the examples that you gave and the interventions of both interventions and measurements were very individualistic. So focused on individuals, people and their relationship to nature through volunteering and things like that. Many of our kind of systems of meaning making, like how we have meaning and some of the other kind of, I can't remember what they're called, 5 pathways to nature connection, are actually fostered through communities, and are collective. So just to give a tricky example, if you took, have you done much work looking at collectives and nature connection and how that's created through collectives, specifically thinking about things like relational values and how relationships to nature shape collective identity? And I'll give you the example of fishers or fisher people or fisher folk. And also relatedly, if we take that example of fish folk, are they nature connected, but maybe do they have detrimental effects on biodiversity potentially, but they're also nature connected? So yeah, how does that all work?
We've not done so much on communities. I suppose we've been very focused on that psychological kind of construct of nature connectedness, and as I say, it's gone from one paper that used the term, and so we've been part of that kind of very much focused on the individual and measuring it at the individual level. But I think that's part of our scaling up, where we're getting community visions of what a close relationship with nature looks like. And I think in some ways we're moving away from the focus on nature connectedness. That's we've established some really useful things to find out at the individual level, but we want to kind of grow, because it's got to happen at community scale. But basically we need more nature connected communities rather than nature connected individuals. But obviously there's a link between the two.
This is a question from online, which is, could you say something a little bit more about how nature connectedness is measured, what the indicators are, what kinds of questions are asked? Or, since that's probably a long and involved answer, perhaps you could point us to some papers where the measurement is detailed.
So there's about a dozen measures of nature connectedness, all psychometric scales. The key, a really useful paper that compares them all is by TAM, TAM. I think that was 2013. So if you do a Google Scholar search for TAM nature connectedness scales, you'll find that where they're all compared, and they're measuring the same construct overall. But they measured slightly. Each have got different questions in, so they might talk about your emotional relationship. They might talk about how nature's part of yourself or not. They might talk about where you go on, what type of vacation that you like. So they're quite varied. Some are a little bit esoteric, so not so good for population measures. And there's one that's more objective, so it looks at reaction times to nature words on the screen. So that's quite interesting as well, so that you can fire nature words up and look at people's response times as well, which is not obviously not a psychometric scale, but a nice approach to take.
So it sounds like most of these scales are subjective self-report.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
So part of the world I live in is in bioethics and philosophy. So one question we ask about self-report and subjective report is, well, what if people are mistaken? How do you know if people are accurate in their self-report on these indicators?
No, that's important to know. And I suppose you've got the online implicit association test, which correlates nicely with the psychometric measures, so that helps. But yeah, there could be some interesting research to be done. There's a little bit using fMRI scanning, for example, to try and look at more connected brain states, which kind of comes from the LSD type research and when the self dissolves kind of thing, which have got parallels. So it'd be quite nice to do that type of work in more nature connected people, or perhaps look at some parallels to when people are looking at bunches of flowers and things like that and responses. But yeah, it would be good to do.
A final question from in the room. Come up to you. Or we'll meet halfway.
Thank you very much. So my question's about direction of causal relationships. And of course, that's super difficult to measure in anything using observational data, which inevitably you're having to, apart from if you can do very narrow experiments on outcomes, such as, yes, as you said, showing people pictures of pretty trees or whatever, but that's not necessarily very helpful in the broader scale. So you mentioned a number of different kind of relationships, and I noticed that most of the time you were very careful to avoid causal language, although sometimes you leant towards somewhat causal language. And I was wondering, so for example, you mentioned a relationship between nature connectedness and how much what the environment was like around people. I wonder about if you can say anything about your hypotheses about direction of causality there. Also the one about life satisfaction. You mentioned a positive relationship between life satisfaction and nature connectedness. And I'd like, just to hear your reflections on causality and also how you might go about unpicking that kind of causal relationship in more detail.
Yeah, a lot of the work has been cross-sectional. There's kind of enough of a body of empirical work for the systematic review that started to suggest there was causal links. I think in the mental health side of things, there's some empirical work that can start to suggest there's some causal relationship. But it's something that we're battling with at the minute, is trying to unpick that. We're currently involved in a project, Connected Treescapes project, looking at the future of UK treescapes and people's perception of treescapes and nature connection and well-being within that. And we're finding the modelling of that very difficult to do because of the many different potential relationships, kind of circular relationships almost. So yeah, there's, as ever in research, there's more to be done on establishing the strength of those causal relationships. But I think the reality is that there's a lot of kind of reciprocal relationships of where there's more nature, there might be more connection, but the people with more connection might seek out the more nature, and it's very difficult to unpick.
Okay, thanks. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much
thank
again
you.
for coming to speak with us. And there is, as I said, there is a reception now and you're all invited. There's drinks and snacks and some books. And I think Miles will be happy to sign any books that
I'll be about.
you might purchase. Thanks very much for coming.
Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Very interesting. It makes me think that if you have sort of a, a really nice measure of nature pathways, I mean, one of the things we like to do is kind of understand the underlying mechanisms on a sort of, not just cognitive models, theoretical models, relationship